The night air was thick enough to drink, heavy with the sweet rot of the Arkansas Delta in late summer. It clung to Silas's skin, a second sheath of sweat and fear. The only sounds were the droning of cicadas and the wet, rhythmic thud of the post driver in his hands. He did not feel the splintered wood against his palms, nor the ache in his shoulders. He felt only the hollow space where his soul used to be, a cavern carved out by grief and rage. Before him, dangling from the crossbeam he had just erected, was the architect of that hollowness, Master Elias Thorne. His eyes were open, glassy and vacant in the moonlight, reflecting a sliver of the pale crescent that hung in the sky like a sickle. A gout of dark blood had dried in a filigree pattern on the collar of his fine linen shirt, the one he'd worn to the county dinner just last night. Silas had used Thorne's own silk cravat to bind his neck to the upright post, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. He worked with a grim, unhurried precision, a craftsman at a task he had rehearsed 1,000 times in the sleepless, sweating dark. He pulled the master's arms out wide, lashing the wrists to the horizontal beam with strips of burlap. The posture was one of crucifixion, but the purpose was different. This was not about salvation. He stripped the man of his polished boots and trousers, replacing them with a pair of his own worn-out, mud-stiffened work pants. He stuffed the master's waistcoat and breeches with straw pulled from the nearby stable, the dry stalks rustling with a sound like whispering secrets. He worked the straw deep into the legs and chest of the clothes he'd put on the corpse, plumping the limbs until they took on a crude, human-like form. He found Thorne's wide-brimmed planter's hat, lying near the sycamore where the final struggle had ended. He placed it on the dead man's head, pulling it down low to shadow the sightless eyes. The effect was immediate and horrifyingly perfect. In the deceptive silver light, the figure looked less like a dead man and more like a sentinel, a guardian set to watch over the endless rows of cotton that had been his kingdom. A scarecrow. Silas stepped back, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The air smelled of freshly turned earth, night-blooming jasmine, and iron. That last smell, the smell of blood, was a ghost on the wind, a memory from another night not so long ago. The jasmine, too. That was Alara's scent. It had clung to her skin, her hair, even after a day's work under the relentless sun. The fragrance now was a torment, a phantom limb of a memory he could feel but never touch. He looked at the thing he had made. It was a monument to an ending. It was a warning. It was the only prayer he had left. A mockingbird began its song from a high branch in the sycamore, a frantic, beautiful cascade of stolen notes. It was the same song Elara used to hum to their little girl, a lullaby of borrowed melodies, pieced together into something uniquely her own. The sound pierced the hollow space inside him, and for a moment, the rage that had fueled him gave way to a sorrow so vast it threatened to pull him under the earth. He pressed the heel of his hand against the scar on his left shoulder, a raised, hard knot of flesh in the shape of a plea, T. It burned, as it always did when he thought of her. Thorne had put it there himself, years ago, to mark his property. Tonight, Silas had unmarked it. He could not stay. The first hint of dawn was a faint, violet bruise on the eastern horizon. Soon the bell would ring. The couldn't he pulled to stee. Overseer Caleb Reed would make his rounds. The discovery would be made. He had one last thing to do. He walked back to his cabin, a place that had been silent for 3 months, a tomb filled with the ghosts of laughter and lullabies. He gathered the few things that mattered: a small, crudely carved wooden bird Elara had made for their daughter, a half-used whetstone, and the last of a cornbread he'd baked 2 days ago. He looked at the empty pallet where they had slept, the faint indentation still visible in the straw mattress. The scent of jasmine was strongest here, a cruel trick of memory. He shut the door without looking back. He moved toward the swamp, the great, tangled wilderness that bordered Thornwood Plantation. The dogs would come. Reed would come. And they would be hunting for more than a runaway. They would be hunting for a monster. A devil who had not only killed a white man, but had desecrated his body, turning the symbol of power into an object of grotesque mockery. They would not understand that the monster had been made, not born, forged in the fires of a master's cruelty and a slave's unbearable loss. Silas slipped into the shadows of the cypress trees, the murky water closing around his ankles. The mockingbird's song faded behind him, and the long, terrible silence of the swamp swallowed him whole. The scarecrow stood its watch over the cotton field, waiting for the sun. The scream that broke the morning calm was not one of surprise, but of pure, throat-shredding terror. It came from a young field hand named Martha, who had been the first to see it. She stood frozen at the edge of the fifth row, her cotton sack dropped in the dirt, one hand covering her mouth and the other pointing a trembling finger. Caleb Reed came running, his face already a mask of impatience. "What in God's name is the matter with you, girl? Get to work." Then he saw it. He stopped, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. For a moment, his mind refused to process the image. It was a scarecrow, yes, but it was wrong. The clothes were too fine, even beneath the stuffing of straw. The hat was thorns. The face, Reed took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. The flies were already gathering, a buzzing black halo around the head. He saw the sightless blue eyes, the slack jaw, the dried blood. A wave of nausea and cold dread washed over him. He had seen death in all its forms: fever, snake bite, the swift violence of a whip laid on too hard, but he had never seen anything like this. This was a violation of the natural order, an act of such profound and blasphemous rebellion that it felt like the earth itself should crack open. He turned away, vomiting into a cotton bush. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his mind racing. Silas! It had to be Silas, the big, quiet man who had gone half-mad with grief after his wife, after the accident. Reed had warned Thorne that Silas was a simmering pot, that his silence was more dangerous than any man's shouting, but Thorne had laughed it off. "Grief softens them, Mr. Reed, makes them compliant." Reed's fury was cold and sharp. He was not a man given to passion. His cruelty was methodical, a tool for maintaining order. This was chaos. He barked orders, his voice raw. "Get back to the cabins, all of you. Jacob, ride to the sheriff in Helena. Tell him Master Thorne has been murdered. Tell him to bring every man he can spare. And the dogs. Tell him to bring the dogs." The news spread through the slave quarters like a fever, a whispered contagion of shock and terror, and a dark, unspoken current of awe. They had all known Silas. They had seen his love for Elara, a fierce, protective thing that was rare and dangerous in a world where such bonds were always at the mercy of a master's whim. They had all heard Elara's fall from the hayloft, the sickening crack, and Thorne's casual explanation that she had been careless. They had all seen Silas afterward, his eyes like burned-out coals, moving through his days like a ghost. No one had imagined this. This was the stuff of legends, of nighttime stories told to frighten children, not something that happened in the light of day. By midday, Thornwood was a hive of frantic activity. Sheriff Brody arrived with a posse of a dozen grim-faced men, their horses churning the dust in the plantation drive. They cut Thorne's body down with a mixture of revulsion and grim purpose, laying it on a blanket. The Scarecrow was unmade, becoming a corpse again. Brody, a heavy-set man, with a face permanently florid from drink and sun, looked at the body and then at the crossbeam still standing in the field. "This wasn't just killing," he said to Reed, his voice a low growl. "This was a sermon." Caleb Reed had already been to Silas's cabin. It was empty, swept clean of any life. But, on the rough-hewn table, he found something, a small wooden bird, carved with incredible detail from a piece of cypress. It was the only thing left behind. Reed picked it up. It felt warm in his hand, imbued with a meaning he could not grasp, but which he knew was important. It was a clue, a taunt. He pocketed it. The dogs arrived, a pair of lean, scarred Catahoula curs with eyes the color of ice. Their handler, a wiry man named Finn, let them scent a piece of Silas's discarded shirt. The dogs strained at their leashes, their low whines building to a cacophony of bays as they caught the trail. It led directly from the field, past Silas's cabin and straight to the edge of the black cypress swamp. Finn spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "He's in there, Sheriff." The fool! Brody looked at the swamp's forbidding edge, a solid wall of green and shadow from which heat and the smell of decay seemed to radiate. No man, black or white, survives in there for long. Snakes, gators, fever. It'll have him before we do. "Maybe," Reed said, his voice tight. He was watching the dark line of trees, his eyes narrowed. He had known Silas for 10 years. He knew Silas knew the swamp better than most. He'd been sent on occasion to hunt game in its shallows, to forage for herbs. And maybe not. He's not just any runaway. A man who does that, he gestured back toward the field, is not thinking about survival. He's thinking about something else entirely. A bounty was set before the sun went down. Reed himself drafted the poster, his handwriting a neat, precise script that belied the savagery of the hunt to come. $500 reward to the murder of Elias Thorne, the runaway Negro Silas. It's Silas, but 6 feet 2 inches in height, powerfully built, late 20s, quiet of disposition, has a prominent branding scar, the letter T, upon his left shoulder, last seen wearing homespun trousers and shirt. He is desperate and may be considered extremely dangerous. Asterisk, Snimes, $500 for his capture and return, alive. Asterisk, the tour's $250 for proof of his death. Copies were sent out with riders to every town and ferry landing within 100 miles. The price was high, high enough to turn a poor farmer into a bounty hunter, high enough to make a neighbor forget his loyalties. $500 was more than a man could make in 2 years of honest work. It was enough to buy a man's soul. Reed had insisted on the alive part. Death in the swamp would be too easy. He wanted Silas back. He wanted him to stand on the gallows, to be made an example of. He wanted to break not just his body, but the myth that was already beginning to form around him before it could take root. The myth of the slave who turned his master into a scarecrow. As the posse prepared to enter the swamp at first light, Reed stood on the porch of the great house, looking out over the fields. The crossbeams still stood, a dark skeleton against the twilight sky. The hands had refused to touch it. It was an object of bad magic now. Reed stared at it, the carved bird heavy in his pocket. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This was more than a hunt for a man. It was a hunt for a ghost, a story. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the swamp would not give up its secrets easily. The swamp was a living thing, and it did not welcome him. It was a cathedral of cypress and tupelo, its canopy so thick that the midday sun was reduced to a dappled, holy twilight. The air was a hot, wet blanket smelling of mud and decaying leaves, a primal perfume of life and death entwined. Silas moved through it not as an invader, but as a supplicant. He waded through water that was sometimes cool against his shins, sometimes warm and stagnant, the color of weak tea. Snakes slid away from his passing, ripples in the dark water. The hum of a million insects was a constant prayer in his ears. He was not just running from the men and the dogs. He was running from the memory of Alara's face, pale and still. He was running from the phantom weight of his daughter Annalise in his arms. But the swamp held its own ghosts. A shaft of light striking a hanging curtain of Spanish moss reminded him of the way Alara's hair would catch the sun. The call of a hidden bird became the echo of Annalise's laughter. Grief was a current in the water, pulling at his legs, trying to drag him down into the silt and mire. His first day was a blur of instinct. He followed game trails, his feet unerringly finding the firmer ground beneath the water. He knew to look for the cypress knees that signaled shallows, to avoid the still, dark pools where gators lay like submerged logs. He ate nothing. Hunger was a distant, unimportant ache compared to the gaping wound in his chest. The brand on his shoulder throbbed, a hot coal pressed to his skin. It was Thorn's mark, the brand of ownership, and it felt heavier now than ever before, a physical anchor to the life he had just violently ended. He had to keep moving. By the second day, he could hear the dogs. Their baying was a faint, mournful sound carried on the humid air, but it was unmistakable. They were coming. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of his grief. It was the fear of the hunted animal, a primal terror that sharpened his senses. He plunged deeper into the swamp, into the places where horses couldn't follow, where men would have to move on foot, slowly and loudly. He found a hollow in the base of a massive cypress, a space barely large enough to crawl into, its entrance masked by a thick curtain of vines. He squeezed inside, the damp, rotting wood pressing against him, and waited. He closed his eyes, and he was back in the hayloft. The air thick with the sweet, dusty smell of hay and the faint, intoxicating scent of jasmine from the vine that grew up the side of the barn. Alara was laughing, her head thrown back, a piece of straw in her hair. They had stolen a few moments away from the fields, a secret rendezvous that was their small act of rebellion. She was telling him about the new lullaby she was making for Annalise, a melody she'd heard from a mockingbird that morning. "It sings whatever it pleases," she'd said, her eyes shining. "Takes a piece of this song, a piece of that one, and makes it new, makes it its own. Like us, Silas. We take the pieces they give us, and we have to make a life of our own." Thorn had found them. His voice, slick with false pleasantry, had cut through their quiet joy. "Well, well, stealing my time, are we?" He had not looked at Silas. His eyes were fixed on Alara, a covetous, proprietary gaze that made Silas's hands clench into fists. He'd made a comment, something vile and suggestive, about how a woman as pretty as her shouldn't be wasting her energy in a hayloft when she could be of better service in the great house. Silas had stepped forward, a single, protective step. He hadn't said a word, but his meaning was clear. Thorn's face had darkened, the pleasantry vanished, replaced by the cold fury of a man whose absolute authority had been questioned, even by a silent gesture. "You forget your place, boy." Thorn had hissed at Silas. Then he'd turned and shoved Alara. Not a hard shove, more of a contemptuous push, but she was off balance, standing near the edge of the loft. She stumbled backward, her arms windmilling. Her cry was short, a sound of pure surprise, that was cut off by the sickening thud of her body hitting the packed earth of the barn floor below. Silas remembered the fall in fractured, slow-motion detail, the flutter of her skirt, the single piece of straw drifting down after her, the sudden, absolute silence. He had scrambled down the ladder, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. She was lying in a broken, unnatural posture. There was blood, so much blood, pooling beneath her. She was 3 months with child, their second child. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering, not knowing what to touch, what to fix. Her eyes were open, looking at him, but they were already losing their light. He saw his own terrified face reflected there. Her lips moved, but only a faint, bloody sigh escaped. The scent of jasmine from the vine outside was overwhelming, cloying. Thorn had looked down from the loft, his face pale, not with remorse, but with annoyance. "Clumsy girl," he'd muttered, before turning and walking away. The memory was a physical assault. Silas gasped for air in the coca hollow of the cypress tree, sweat pouring down his face. The dogs were closer now. He could hear their individual voices, the deep baritone of one, the frantic yapping of the other. He could hear men's voices, too, Reed's sharp commands, another man's curses as he stumbled. He pressed himself deeper into the tree, his hand closing around the small wooden bird in his pocket. He had carved it for Annalise on her first birthday. It was a mockingbird, its head cocked as if in mid-song. He'd told her it was a magic bird, that as long as she kept it, she would always hear her mother's lullaby. After Ilara's death, the child had withered. A light had gone out in her. She refused to eat, and a wasting fever took her within a month. She had died in his arms, her small body terrifyingly light, clutching the wooden bird in her hand. He had buried her next to her mother, under the whitmore sycamore tree. 2 small, unmarked graves. Thorn had not allowed him even a simple cross. "They're not worth the wood," he'd said. The hunters passed his hiding place. He heard the slosh of their boots in the water, the snapping of a twig no more than 10 feet away. He held his breath until his lungs burned. The dogs were frantic, whining and circling, confused by the water that masked his scent. "He's playing tricks," he heard Finn, the dog handler, say. "Doubled back on his own trail, maybe, or climbed a tree. He's in here." Reed's voice was cold, certain. "He can't have gone far. Spread out. Check every hollow log, every thicket. I want him found." The voices receded. Silas waited for what felt like an eternity, his body cramped and screaming with tension. When silence returned, broken only by the swamp's own hum, he crawled out. He was coated in mud and decaying wood, the smell of the grave clinging to him. He was no longer just a man. He was becoming part of the swamp, a creature of mud and shadow. He looked down at his hands. They were the hands that had built fences and picked cotton. They were the hands that had held his wife and cradled his child. They were the hands that had killed a man and turned him into a thing of straw and mockery. They were a stranger's hands. He didn't know them anymore. He moved on, driven now by more than just the instinct to flee. He was being hunted, but he was also a hunter. He was hunting for a place where the memories could not find him, a place beyond the reach of Thorn's ghost. But the further he went, the more he realized there was no such place. The ghosts were not behind him. They were inside him. The lullaby Ilara hummed was the beat of his own heart. The scent of jasmine was in his every breath. The brand on his shoulder was a map of his own pain. He could not escape them, so he would have to learn to live with them, to carry them with him through the mire. He was a walking grave, a vessel of memory, and his journey had only just begun. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light and the deepening ache of hunger. Silas learned the rhythms of the swamp. He learned to catch frogs with his bare hands, their cool, slick bodies pulsing with life for a moment before he silenced them. He ate them raw, the taste metallic and wild. He found cattail roots and dug them from the mud, their starchy flesh a welcome relief. He learned which berries were safe, staining his lips and fingers purple. He was becoming gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, but his eyes burned with a new kind of intensity. The softness of the man who had loved and laughed in a hayloft was being burned away, leaving something harder, something forged in solitude and desperation. He moved mostly at night, using the stars that glittered in the gaps of the canopy as his guide. He was heading north, though he had no destination in mind. North was a direction, a concept, a prayer. It was the opposite of Thornwood. During the day, he would find a place to hide and rest, often perched high in the branches of a cypress, wedged between the trunk and a thick limb, dozing in fits and starts, his sleep plagued by visions. He saw Ilara, not as she was in the barn, but as she was on their wedding night, her smile shy in the moonlight. He saw Annalise, chasing fireflies in the dusk, her giggles like tiny bells. These dreams were a sweet agony, and he would wake with tears on his cheeks, the salt stinging the dozens of insect bites that covered his face and arms. The hunters were relentless. He would see their campfires from a distance, small, angry eyes in the vast darkness. He would hear the dogs, sometimes close, sometimes far, their baying a constant reminder that he was not free. He was merely at large. Caleb Reed, he knew, would not give up. Reed was a man who saw the world as a set of accounts that must be balanced. A slave had killed a master. That was a debt that could only be paid in blood and suffering. One afternoon, sheltering from a sudden downpour under a rock outcropping at the swamp's edge, he saw a patrol of 3 men. They were not from the posse. They were bounty hunters, drawn by the promise of $500. They moved with a predatory confidence, their rifles held at the ready. One of them, a tall, skeletal man in a preacher's black coat, was leading. Silas watched them pass, his heart a slow, heavy drum. These men were different. The posse was about order. These men were about money. They would be more cunning and more cruel. He began to leave false trails, doubling back on his own tracks, wading for miles in winding creeks to break the scent. He used every bit of woodcraft he knew, skills learned as a boy, long before he'd come to Thornwood. He became a whisper, a rumor in the trees. The hunt was changing him, honing him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now overlaid with a sharp, calculating focus. He was no longer just prey. He was a player in a deadly game. One evening he stumbled upon a small, isolated cabin, built on a raised spit of land deep within the swamp. A thin curl of smoke rose from its mud and stick chimney. His first instinct was to flee, but a smell wafted on the air that stopped him in his tracks. The smell of roasting meat. The hunger, which had been a dull ache, became a ravenous, clawing beast inside him. He crept closer, moving from tree to tree, his bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. An old woman sat on the cabin's small porch, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes as dark and clouded as the swamp water. She was smoking a clay pipe, her gaze fixed on the trees, as if she were expecting him. She did not seem surprised when he finally stepped out of the shadows. "The swamp provides what a body needs," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "And sometimes it provides who a body needs. You look hungry, son." Silas stood frozen, wary. He had heard stories of the conjure women who lived in the deep swamp, women who traded in roots and spirits, who owed allegiance to no master. "I have nothing to trade," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. She chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across the billow ground. "Everyone has something to trade. A story, a sorrow. Come, the gator meat is fresh." He ate like a wolf, tearing at the roasted meat she offered him on a piece of bark. He didn't care what it cost. The woman, whose name was Hetty, watched him without speaking. When he was finished, she refilled her pipe. "They call you the Scarecrow man," she said. "The story has traveled faster than you have. They say you have the devil in you." "The devil is a master with a soft voice and a hard hand," Silas replied, wiping grease from his chin. "True enough," she said, puffing on her pipe, "but what they've made you is a story. And a story is a powerful thing. It can be a weapon, or it can be a cage. You carry a heavy weight, Scarecrow man. Not the killing. That was just a balancing of the scales. But the grief, that's a ghost that will drown you if you let it." She looked at his left shoulder, though it was covered by his tattered shirt. "That mark you wear, it's a chain. It binds you to the man you killed. As long as you wear it, you'll be his." Silas touched the scar through the cloth. It felt hot, as if she had laid a fire on it with her words. He stayed with her for 2 days. She showed him how to find willow bark for fever and jewelweed for poison ivy. She taught him how to read the subtle signs of the swamp, the way the frogs fell silent when a predator was near, the direction of the wind in the highest branches. She did not ask about Alara or his child, but he felt her knowing gaze on him, as if she could see the hollow spaces inside him. On the second night, she built a small fire. She took a knife, its blade worn thin with use, and heated it in the flames until it glowed a dull red. "A story needs a proper ending," she said, her voice low and hypnotic. "Or a new beginning. The flesh remembers what the mind tries to forget. Sometimes you have to burn the old story out to make room for a new one. This will hurt, but you are no stranger to hurt." She held the knife out to him. He understood. This was the trade she wanted. Not for the food, but for the lesson. He took the knife. His hand was steady. He pulled his shirt off. In the flickering firelight, the branded T seemed to writhe on his skin, a living symbol of his bondage. He looked at the glowing blade, then at the old woman's unblinking eyes. He took a deep breath, the air thick with smoke and jasmine from a vine climbing the side of her cabin. The scent was not a torment this time. It was a benediction. He pressed the hot metal to his own skin. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot, searing agony that eclipsed everything else. The scent stalks resor bisu firm. Smell of his own burning flesh filled the air. But as he held the blade to the scar, tracing over the hated lines of the clatter T, he was not just burning his skin. He was burning away Thorn. He was burning away the property tag, the ownership, the years of silent deference. He was cauterizing a wound that was more than skin deep. When he was done, he fell back, gasping, sweat and tears mingling on his face. The Ein T was gone, replaced by a raw, weeping wound, a chaotic starburst of his own making. It was his mark now. Hetty packed the burn with a poultice of chewed herbs that soothed the fire. "Now," she said, her voice soft, "now you are just a man again. Go north. Cross the great river. A man with no master and no name can be anything he wants." He left before dawn, his shoulder a universe of pain. But his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. He had faced the ghost in his own flesh and seared it away. The dogs were still out there. Reed was still out there. But they were hunting a man who no longer existed. They were hunting Thorn Silas. And Thorn Silas was dead. The man who walked north through the swamp was someone new. A man scarred but unmarked. A man who carried his ghosts not as a burden, but as a compass. The letter arrived in Helena by riverboat, addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, a week after her husband's funeral. It was from her sister in Vicksburg, and its pages, filled with elegant, looping script, were a stark contrast to the brutal reality that had consumed Thornwood. "My dearest Eleanor, I cannot express the horror with which I received your last letter. To think of poor Elias meeting such a savage end, it is a testament to the dark and ungrateful nature of the creatures we are forced to live amongst. You must be beside yourself with fear. Is it true what they are saying? That the beast made a spectacle of him in the field? I pray it is merely a ghastly rumor born of panic. Do gangrene bide. Here in Vicksburg, the talk is of nothing but secession and war. The men are full of fire and vinegar, certain that a swift victory will secure our way of life forever. But after hearing of your tragedy, I confess my heart is filled with a different kind of fear. If one of them can harbor such a devilish spirit, what of the thousands of others who surround us? It is as if we are sleeping on a volcano. I pray Mr. Reed, whom you have always spoken of so highly, finds this monster Silas and makes an example of him that will echo through the generations. You must be strong, my dear sister. God will provide. Eleanor Thorne let the letter fall into her lap. She sat in the parlor of the great house, the curtains drawn against the SOS, oppressive afternoon sun. The house was too quiet. The servants moved on tiptoe, their faces masks of careful neutrality. She knew what they were whispering in the kitchens and the quarters. They were not afraid of Silas. They were in awe of him. He had done the unthinkable, and in doing so, he had become something more than a man. He was a story, and the story was more powerful than Caleb Reed's dogs or the sheriff's posse. Reed himself had just left. He had stood before her, hat in hand, his face grim and dusted with the red clay of the county roads. The hunt was a month old, and it was failing. "He's like smoke, ma'am," Reed had said, his voice tight with frustration. "We find his trail, and then it just vanishes. The dogs get confused. Men have seen things in that swamp shadows, moving where there's nothing. Some of the posse are starting to lose their nerve. They're saying he has Conjure on his side." "Conjure, Mr. Reed?" Eleanor's voice was brittle. "Or is he just cleverer than you are?" Reed's jaw tightened. "He knows the swamp, and he's got the devil's own luck. We found a camp a few days ago. The bounty hunters, the one they call the preacher, and his 2 partners. All 3 of them dead. Throats cut. Their supplies were gone, but their money was untouched. It wasn't robbery." Eleanor felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Silas, the quiet man who repaired the stable roof, who had always been so gentle with the horses, this was not him. This was someone else. Something else. The swamp had remade him. "He's heading north," Reed continued, "towards the Mississippi. If he crosses that river, he's as good as gone. I'm taking every man I can trust, and we're going to try and cut him off at Friar's Point." He paused, then reached into his pocket. He placed the small, carved mockingbird on the polished mahogany table between them. "We found this in his cabin. I believe it belonged to his child." Eleanor stared at the little wooden bird. She remembered the child, Annalise, a solemn, beautiful girl with her mother's eyes. She remembered Alara, too, a woman whose quiet dignity had always been a silent rebuke to her husband's casual cruelties. She remembered Elias coming into the house the day Alara died, his face pale, muttering about the girl's clumsiness. She had suspected, even then, that there was more to the story. She had chosen to believe the lie because it was easier. The truth was a crack in the foundation of her world, and she could not afford to look into it. Now, the crack had split her world open. The bird sat on the table, a silent accusation. Meanwhile, Silas was no longer thinking in terms of days, but of distances. The river was a presence he could feel long before he saw it, a change in the air, a low, constant murmur on the edge of hearing. The swamp was thinning, giving way to bottomland forest and tangled thickets of cane. He moved with a lean, wolf-like grace, his body hardened by the journey, his senses preternaturally sharp. The burn on his shoulder had scabbed over into a puckered, angry scar, a chaotic pattern that belonged only to him. He was a new man, baptized in pain and solitude. He had not intended to kill the bounty hunters. He had stumbled upon their camp by accident, drawn by the smell of coffee. He had hidden in the undergrowth, intending only to watch and wait for them to move on. But then he heard them talking. The one called the preacher was a gaunt man with fanatic's eyes, and he was describing in lurid detail what they would do to Silas when they caught him. He spoke of hot irons and slow knives, quoting scripture as he did, twisting the words of God into a manual for torture. He spoke of the $500, and how it would be sweeter for delivering the runaway alive, as Mr. Reed had requested. Something inside Silas had snapped. It was not the thought of his own pain. It was the casual, righteous cruelty in the man's voice. It was Thorne's voice, the sheriff's voice, the voice of the entire world that had taken everything from him. He had waited until they slept. He moved through their camp like a phantom, his knife, honed to a razor's edge on his whetstone, in his hand. It was swift, silent, and brutal. He had felt nothing. It was like clearing away vermin. He took their food, a spare blanket, and a small pouch of salt. He left the money. This was not about wealth. It was about survival. and about a justice the world of men would never grant him. Now, the river was close. He could smell it, a clean, muddy scent that was a relief after the cloying decay of the deep swamp. He knew this was the final barrier. Reed would know he was heading for the river. He would be waiting. The hunt was not over. It was merely entering its final, most dangerous phase. He reached the riverbank at dusk. The Mississippi was a vast, brown serpent, powerful and indifferent, its surface roiling with hidden currents. The opposite shore was a hazy, indistinct line, the promised land of Illinois, of freedom. But between him and that shore was a mile of treacherous water, and, he was certain, Caleb Reed. He scouted the bank for hours, moving like a ghost through the willows and cottonwoods. He finally saw them, a camp set up near a known ferry crossing, their fire carefully shielded. He could make out at least a half-dozen men, Reed among them. They were waiting for him to make a mistake, to try to steal a boat, to attempt a desperate swim. Silas knew he could not fight them. He had to outwit them. He retreated from the riverbank, a plan forming in his mind, a plan born of desperation and the stories Hetty had told him, stories of spirits and misdirection. He spent the next day gathering what he needed: dry reeds, a length of grapevine, and a small, rotting log. As night fell, a thick fog began to roll in off the river, a gift from the swamp, a shroud for his escape. He worked quickly in the deepening twilight. He fashioned a small, crude raft, just big enough to support the log. He took the bounty hunter's blanket and draped it over the log, creating a rough, human-like shape. He set his creation adrift in a current that he knew would carry it downstream, past the watchers' camp. Then he waited. The shout went up about an hour later. "There! In the water! Someone's trying to cross!" He heard the chaos erupt in their camp. Men shouting, horses being mounted. They would be moving downriver, chasing the decoy. It would buy him time. But not much. Now was his chance. He went back to the riverbank, to the spot he had chosen, a place where a massive, uprooted sycamore lay half in the water, its tangled roots providing a screen. He took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling his lungs. He held the small wooden mockingbird in his hand, its smooth, familiar shape a comfort. He whispered Ilara's name, and Annalise's. This was for them. He slipped into the Mississippi. The cold was a violent shock, stealing his breath, the current, a powerful hand that immediately tried to pull him under and drag him south. He was a strong swimmer, but this was not a pond or a creek. This was a force of nature. He kicked off the bank, aiming not straight across but diagonally, using the current, fighting it only enough to keep his heading. The fog was thick around him, disorienting. He could see nothing but the swirling brown water and the ghostly white mist. The shouts of the posse faded behind him. He was alone, a tiny, insignificant speck in the immense, dark world of the river. His muscles screamed with effort. The water was trying to pull him down. The cold was leaching the strength from his limbs. For a moment, despair washed over him. It was too far. He was not strong enough. He closed his eyes and saw Ilara's face, smiling at him from the hayloft. He heard her voice, humming the mockingbird's lullaby. Takes a piece of this song, a piece of that one, and makes it new. Makes it its own. He was not just swimming, he was unmaking himself, washing away the man he had been. He was crossing into a new life. He opened his eyes and kicked harder, his movements finding a new rhythm, a rhythm of pure will. He would not sink. He would not be a ghost in the mud. He would be the mockingbird, flying free. He did not know how long he was in the water. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the struggle, the cold, and the song in his head. Then, his hand touched something solid. Mud. He had reached the other side. He clawed his way up the slick bank, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold, and collapsed onto the soil of Illinois. He had done it. He was across. He lay there for a long time, the mud of a free state clinging to him like a new skin, his breath coming in ragged sobs of relief and disbelief. He was alive. He was free, or so he thought. A twig snapped behind him. He rolled over, his heart leaping into his throat. A figure stood over him, silhouetted against the fog, a rifle held loosely in his hands. It was not Reed. It was not the sheriff. It was a farmer, a homesteader, his face etched with suspicion, drawn by the sound of Silas's labored breathing. "You a runaway?" the farmer asked, his voice flat, emotionless. Silas lay on the ground, his energy gone, the river having taken his last ounce of strength. He looked at the man, at the rifle, at the miles of unknown country that stretched before him. He had crossed the river, but he had not escaped. He was still a black man in a white man's world, still a commodity, a threat, a problem to be solved. The farmer's gaze flickered down to Silas's left shoulder, where his tattered shirt had been torn away during the swim, revealing the raw, star-shaped scar. He looked at it for a long moment, then back at Silas's face. He saw the exhaustion, the desperation, the defiance burning in his eyes. He saw the story written there. "There's a bounty on a man from Arkansas," the farmer said, his voice quiet. "A big one. They say he killed his master. They say he's a devil." Silas did not speak. He just watched the man, waiting. This was the moment. His entire journey, the flight, the swamp, the river, it had all led to this, to a stranger with a rifle, on a muddy riverbank in the fog. The farmer shifted his weight, the rifle barrel moving slightly. He looked back across the river, toward the distant, muffled shouts of the posse. Then he looked back at Silas. "Get up," he said. The command hung in the air, heavy with all the power of the world Silas had just escaped. But the farmer's tone was not threatening. It was something else. Something Silas had not heard from a white man in a very long time. He slowly, painfully got to his feet. He stood before the farmer, muddy, half-naked and shivering, but his back was straight. The farmer gestured with his rifle, not at Silas, but toward a faint flickering light in the distance. "My place is a mile that way. The wife's got a stew on. You can get warm before you move on. But you can't stay. By morning, the bounty hunters and the patrols will be thick as flies on this side of the river, too." Silas stared at him, uncomprehending. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice a raw whisper. The farmer shrugged, a complex, weary gesture. "I don't hold with the buying and selling of men. And anyone who can make it across that river on a night like this, well, I reckon he's earned a bowl of stew. Now come on, before you freeze to death." He turned and started walking toward the light, not looking back to see if Silas was following. He was offering a choice, an act of trust as wide and dangerous as the river itself. Silas stood for a moment on the bank of the Mississippi, a man between two worlds. Behind him was the darkness of the swamp, the ghost of his master, the graves of his wife and child. Ahead of him was a stranger's fire and an unknown, perilous freedom. He clutched the small wooden bird in his pocket, its sharp edges a comfort against his palm. Then he took a step and another, following the farmer into the fog-shrouded promise of the north. Caleb Reed stood on the Illinois bank the next morning, the rising sun burning the last of the fog off the river. The decoy raft had been found snagged on a sandbar 5 miles downstream. There was no sign of Silas. No body had washed ashore. There were tracks, yes, a single set, coming out of the river, but they vanished in the thick grass 100 yards from the bank. Sheriff Brody spat into the water. "He's gone, vanished like a ghost. Maybe a gator got him midstream." Reed said nothing. He was looking at the vast, unfamiliar landscape of the Free State. It felt like another country, hostile and alien. He knew, with a gut-deep certainty, that Silas had made it. The man he had hunted, the man who had left a scarecrow in a cotton field, was not the kind of man to be taken by a gator. He was something else. Reed had failed. The account was not balanced. The story did not have the ending he had written for it. And that, more than anything, was what galled him. The story was out of his control now. It belonged to the whispers in the slave quarters, to the fearful gossip in the parlors. It belonged to the swamp. He turned back toward the boat that would take him back to Arkansas, back to Thornwood. He felt the carved bird in Fison's cerise in his pocket. He had meant to give it to Mrs. Thorne, but had taken it back. It was a piece of the puzzle he couldn't solve, a relic of the man he couldn't catch. He threw it, as hard as he could, into the middle of the river. It hit the brown water with a tiny splash and was gone. But he knew it didn't matter. You couldn't drown a story. It would just wash up somewhere else, on some other shore, waiting to be told again. De May, 1937. Crittenden County, Arkansas. The young man from the Federal Writers Project sat on the sagging porch of a shotgun shack, a notepad balanced on his knee. His name was William, and he was a long way from his home in Chicago, sent south to collect the stories of former slaves before they were all lost to time. The woman he was interviewing, an ancient, wizened soul named Rose, claimed to be 102 years old. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but her memory was a clear, deep well. She had been a girl at Thornwood when it happened. They called him the Scarecrow Man, she said, her voice a reedy whisper, thin as onion skin. I was just a little thing, but I remember the screaming that morning. And I remember the fear. The white folks, they was scared, but us, we was scared too, but it was a different kind of scared. It was like when you see lightning strike a big oak tree right next to you. It's terrifying, but it's powerful. You ain't never seen nothing like it. William scribbled furiously, trying to capture her exact words. He had heard whispers of this story in the nearby town, a local piece of folklore. A bogeyman used to frighten children. But this was the first time he'd heard it from someone who was there. Did they ever catch him? He asked. Rose cackled, a dry, rattling sound. Catch Silas? No, child. You can't catch smoke. Mr. Reed, the overseer, he hunted him for a month, but the swamp, it protected its own. They said Silas learned the swamp's secrets. Said he could talk to the birds and walk on the water. They said he burned the master's mark off his own skin with a hot knife, and in the fire he was reborn. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Some folks said he died in the river. Some said he made it north and joined the Union Army, came back as a soldier to burn down all the great houses. My mama, she used to say something different. She'd sing this little song to us, a lullaby she said she learned from Silas's wife Elara. All about a mockingbird makin', a new song from old pieces. She hummed a few bars, a strange, beautiful melody that seemed both familiar and entirely unique. Mama said Silas didn't run north or die. She said he stayed right here, in the swamp, that he became a part of it, a spirit, and that on nights when the fog is thick on the river, if you're a runaway or you're in some kind of deep trouble, the Scarecrow Man will come and guide you to safety. He's a guardian, you see, not a monster. He just took all his pain and grief and turned it into a shield for others. William looked up from his notes, captivated. The historical event had been swallowed by myth, transformed from a brutal act of revenge into a story of protective magic and enduring resistance. The man had disappeared, but the legend had grown, tended by the memories and the needs of a people. Years later, long after William had filed his report, the old Thornwood plantation house, which had stood abandoned for decades, was finally torn down. In the process of dismantling the fireplace in the main parlor, a workman found a loose brick. Behind it, in a small, hollowed-out space, was a leather-bound journal. It was the diary of Eleanor Thorne. Most of it was filled with mundane entries about social calls and household management. But the last few pages, written in a shaky, agitated hand in the weeks after her husband's murder, were different. Nymanasa 17th, 1861. Nymanasa 7. Mr. Reed has returned. He failed. The creature is gone. He claims he vanished, but I see the truth in his eyes. He was outsmarted. Outwitted by a man he considered little more than an animal. There is a terrible poetry in that. Elias was so proud of his intelligence, his mastery over his world. And in the end, he was undone by the silent grief of one man, a grief he himself had authored. I found it today, while clearing out Elias's desk. A letter, tucked away from a slave trader in Natchez. It was dated the day before Alara's accident. Elias was arranging to sell her. He wrote of her insolent beauty and defiant spirit, which he believed would fetch a high price. He was going to sell her south, away from her child, away from Silas. He never told me. He was going to break their family apart for profit and spite. She must have found out. Or perhaps she fought him. And she fell. It was not an accident. It was a struggle. My husband was a murderer, long before Silas laid a hand on him. We are all living on a foundation of sin and blood, and I am afraid the cracks are finally showing. The journal ended there. The historical record was a cold, stark thing. Elias Thorne, murdered by his slave, Silas, who subsequently escaped and was never captured. But the truth was a far more tangled and haunted landscape. The story of the Scarecrow man lived on in the Arkansas Delta. It changed with each telling, absorbing new details, shedding old ones. Sometimes Silas had wings like a great black bird. Sometimes his eyes glowed in the dark. He became a symbol, a testament to the fact that even in a system designed to strip a person of their humanity, the human spirit could not be extinguished. It could be bent, broken, and scarred, but it could also, when pushed to the unimaginable edge, transform. It could turn rage into a statement, grief into a legend, and a man into a myth that would haunt the landscape of his suffering long after his oppressors had turned to dust. The nature of freedom, then, is not merely the absence of chains. It is the power to write one's own story, to reclaim one's own name. Silas the slave ceased to exist on that night in the cotton field. What he became is uncertain. A soldier, a ghost, a free man in the North, who lived a quiet life under a new name, forever looking over his shoulder. Or perhaps all of them. The ambiguity is the point. He escaped the narrative that had been written for him by his masters and entered the realm of folklore, where his story could be told and retold, a song made of borrowed pieces, remade into something new, something that belonged to everyone and no one, a lullaby for the dispossessed, a haunting melody on the wind, a promise that even in the deepest darkness, a man can refuse to be a scarecrow for another's harvest, and instead become the guardian of his own savage and sacred memory.